Chapter 039. Suspicious Coincidences. Zorian stared at his tormentor in silence, as relaxed and impassive as one could be when faced with such a pitiless, unreasonable man. Svim stared back at him, his face a picture of unshakable, effortless composure that made Zorian's best efforts at stoicism appear laughable in comparison. Still, he wouldn't break. He didn't break. He had, eventually, met every ridiculous demand Svim had given him and had never blown up at the man even once. Of course, that hadn't impressed the man any, even when he'd demonstrated insanely good shaping skills for a third-year student, but he'd expected as much. They continued staring at each other in silence for several seconds. That, Svim finally decided, was terrible. You are inflexible, slow, yet paradoxically impatient. I see in you a tendency to overreach, Mr. Kaczynski, moving on to advanced fields of study without a healthy foundation to back it up. A common problem with many of your fellow mages, true, but everyone else is doing it was never a valid excuse for anything. We will have to work on that before we tackle anything more substantial. Of course, sir, Zorian said calmly. I'll be sure to practice everything you've shown me back at home. Good. I expect a better performance on our second session, said Svim, leaning back in his chair before making a shooing motion with his hand. You are dismissed. Zorian made a solemn nod, slowly rose from his chair and then fled the office as fast as he could without making it obvious he was in a hurry to leave. Only when he shut the door and put some distance from the room did he let himself relax. That could have ended up badly. Very, very badly. He knew he'd be taking a risk when he tried to read Svim's mind, but the man had aggravated him so much that he couldn't help himself. Besides, what were the chances of Svim deciding to shield his mind for a meeting with one of his students? Pretty good, apparently, because Zorian encountered a powerful mental shield when he tried to read his thoughts. He withdrew immediately, terrified that his telepathic probe had been noticed by the man, but whatever defenses Svim had apparently gave the man too little feedback to notice Zorian's relatively delicate attack. Well, that or he did notice but decided not to say anything, but that seemed very unlikely. If that were the case, he would have at least made a snide comment or two about how sloppy Zorian's attempt was, even if he wasn't at all bothered by the attempt itself. It was very interesting that Svim had bothered shielding his mind for their meeting, though. Was Svim one of those mages who kept their mind shielded at all times, or did he somehow know about Zorian's talents? There were a lot of possibilities. Zorian made a mental note to barge into the man's office unannounced at some point in the next week, just to see if Svim had his mind shielded even when not expecting Zorian to arrive. His thoughts were still preoccupied with Svim when he arrived back home, at which point the realization that he could sense the minds of Nachka and her mother in the house pushed the topic of his so-called mentor out of his mind. That was unexpected. There had been no plans for them to visit as far as he knew. He entered the house and made a beeline towards the kitchen, where he could sense Amaya and Ray were currently situated, and found them seated around the kitchen table, gossiping over some cookies and plum brandy? Well, whatever. After exchanging greetings, he tried to ask Ray about her reasons for coming unannounced without sounding rude and accusing. He didn't quite succeed if the dirty look Amaya shot him was any indication, but Ray herself didn't seem to mind. Nachka was being impatient about your next visit, so I decided to take her to Kiriel instead, she explained. Besides, it is not fair to make you spend your time on bringing your sister over to my home. You are a student of magic with many additional obligations aside, I'm told, and I am but a simple housewife with plenty of free time. Simple housewife. Right. If she really was what she claimed to be, he wouldn't do anything crazy, but he'd be shocked. It was possible, but she was too confident and emotionally composed to be some ordinary housewife. For myself, I have no complaint about Nachka coming here from time to time, Amaya piped in. So you need not worry about any complaint from me. I see, Zorian said slowly. He looked at Ray and found her unflinchingly meeting his gaze. Though his empathy detected no hostile intent and she didn't do anything overtly threatening, he found her vaguely unsettling. It was her body language, he realized. Though her posture was relaxed, she did not fidget or move at all. Making a snap decision, Zorian decided to take a risk for the second time in a day and dived into her surface thoughts. He didn't want to get too comfortable with violating the mental sanctity of people around him, but if a person looked like a threat, he felt it was justified. And Ray definitely looked suspicious to him right now. Ree's mind was not shielded, and she gave no indication that she detected his intrusion. that said he didn't get anything worthwhile out of it. She was not feeling very introspective at the moment, nor thinking any incriminating thoughts. Mostly she seemed to be studying him even as he was doing the same to her. Much like Zorian could tell she was not a normal housewife, she too seemed aware that he was anything but a normal student. He decided to get her talking about her background and current situation, hopefully guiding her thoughts down the path that would reveal what her deal was. Besides, Amaya seemed to be getting more and more uncomfortable with their silent stare-down, so if nothing else he should break the silence to calm her down a little. I just realized I never did ask you why you and your family moved into Cyoria, said Zorian. I bet it's a fascinating story. Over the next half an hour, Zorian spoke with Rei about her life and recent history, with Amaya occasionally jumping in with her opinion. Despite his efforts, Zorian failed to uncover any deep secret from Rei's thoughts. Her mind was too focused on what she was saying, with little in the way of internal musings or stray thoughts. The only thing Zorian could tell with certainty was that she hadn't lied even once while talking to him. Her story about her family moving from a small rural town to Cyoria out of simple desire for a better life in the big city was something she honestly believed in, rather than some cliched cover story. Her husband wanted a better-paying job he could not get in their old home. Rei wanted to get away from their rather unpleasant neighbors who were spreading nasty rumors about her whenever they could get away with it, and they were both unhappy with the poor state of the local school and wanted better for Nachka. So they moved. Simple as that. Currently they were still in the process of setting up in Cyoria, and were thus having some money problems, but Rei seemed unconcerned about that, claiming it to be a temporary issue. His mind reading did pick up on two interesting things. First, Rei had ridiculously good hearing. Throughout the entire conversation she was somehow picking up on the conversation Kiriel and Nachka were having in another part of the house, separated from the kitchen by a corridor and two closed doors. Zorian himself could not hear a thing from the two girls, no matter how hard he strained his ears. Secondly, while Rei did not know he was reading her mind, she was pretty good at figuring out people's moods and motives the old-fashioned way. She realized pretty quickly he was suspicious of her and trying to interrogate her. And she found it amusing. Very, very amusing. Eventually, Zorian was forced to admit defeat, withdrawing from Rei's mind and excusing himself so he could leave. At the very least he was mollified that Rei did not seem to have any sinister plan for him and Kiriel, which was really all he cared about in regards to her. She could keep her secrets so long as they didn't come back to haunt him later. Oh yes, I nearly forgot, Amaya said as he turned to leave. Kale said he wanted to talk to you when you get back. He's in the basement right now, tinkering with his alchemical equipment again. Thanking her for the information, Zorian descended into the basement to see what Kale wanted from him. It could be any number of things, really. He had dropped a multitude of bizarre problems on the Morlock boy since they'd met in this restart, and he counted himself lucky that Kale was so reasonable and level-headed about what he had learned. He had to admit, with no small amount of embarrassment, that he himself probably wouldn't have taken it half as well in his place. Then again he had the feeling that Kale's willingness to accept his explanation about the time loop came from greed. He was sure that Kale saw the time loop less as a terrifying anomaly and more as a fantastic opportunity that could catapult his skills and knowledge immensely if he played his cards right, and that doubtlessly influenced how inclined he was to accept Zorian's story as truthful. Case in point. Ah, you're here, Kale greeted him. Did you get the ingredients I asked of you? Yup, said Zorian, reaching into his bag and withdrawing a wooden box full of alchemical ingredients. There were no problems? Kale asked, accepting the box and promptly opening it to examine the contents. He pulled out one of the bottles from the box, the one full of inky black liquid, and brought it towards the light to check something. No. The shopkeeper looked at me strangely for buying so many expensive ingredients, but said nothing in the end. It would still probably be smart to buy the next batch from some other shop, though. Probably, agreed Kale, putting the bottle back and snapping the box shut. There was no offer of reimbursing Zorian for his expenses. One of the first demands Kale had of Zorian once he decided the time loop thing had something to it was for Zorian to finance his experiments to the best of his ability. He understood Kale's demand for what it was. Not just a way for the boy to secure more funding, but also a challenge for Zorian to prove he believed what he was saying. After all, if he really believed in his own time loop story, he wouldn't care at all about spending his money like that, would he? Kale placed the box on the work table next to him, depositing it among the many other boxes, ceramic bowls, glass bottles and other alchemical instruments that cluttered Kale's workspace. He seemed to be lost in thought for a moment, his bright blue eyes rapidly scanning the rest of the basement, before he focused back to his conversation with Zorian. "How often do you think you'll be able to buy more?" he asked. "Well, I hesitate to say as often as you need me to, since I'm sure you can burn through any amount of money I have if you go wild, but I'm pretty loaded right now. Thanks to the time loop, I found a very time-efficient way to extract a great deal of crystallized mana from Nyazovdveri's underworld, and selling that has given me a huge amount of money to spend," Zorian explained. "So, 2 or 3 boxes like that a day if I had to. Maybe more, but I really think that would be a bad idea, since I don't think I'd be able to avoid unwelcome attention if I started buying so much expensive stuff." "I see," Kale said slowly, clearly more than a little surprised at the information. "That's a lot of money. Out of curiosity, why did you go to the trouble to get so much? Funds for your own experiments?" "Partially," said Zorian. "It certainly makes things a lot easier when you can throw around money like it's nothing. Saves time. And yes, I know it's strange for that to be a concern when you're stuck in an ever-repeating time loop. And the other part? Greed, I guess," Zorian admitted. "When I finally break out of the time loop, I kinda want to have all my monetary concerns taken care of. Probably not the best use of my time, but Don't worry, I understand you completely," said Kale, smiling slightly. "I probably wouldn't have been able to resist doing so myself. In fact, I probably would have done it much sooner, even with the threat of other time travelers and the presence of more pressing problems you're dealing with. So many problems in my life would have disappeared if I had 1,000,000 pieces or so." "Well, you are an alchemist," Zorian said. "Your profession has always been very expensive to practice, unless you were one of those alchemists who were willing to limit themselves to components they could grow and personally harvest in the wilderness. It makes perfect sense that you'd want to get rich if given a chance. Perhaps. I don't think I'd be anywhere near as efficient about it as you are, though. Well, not without resorting to theft. The thought of looking for crystallized mana would have never occurred to me. What's so valuable about it that people are willing to pay so much?" Zorian gave Kale a curious look. "It's a bit strange to hear an alchemist ask that. I'm pretty sure that powdered crystallized mana is an important potion ingredient. Not in the kind of potions I'm making," Kale said, shaking his head. Well, crystallized mana is basically ambient mana in solid form. Harder to make use of than ambient mana, since it first has to be broken down into the more familiar, ethereal form before you can use it to power anything, but it is very convenient as a mana battery. Most mana batteries, such as the ones made with spell formulas, lose all stored mana in a couple of days to a week. Crystallized mana, on the other hand, is completely stable in normal circumstances. That's very useful if you want to, say, support a powerful magical item or warding scheme independently of ambient mana levels," explained Zorian. So these are the crystals the new trains use for fuel," said Kale. "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "I heard that use of crystallized mana as train fuel is really driving the prices of it upwards lately, got a bunch of people worried. Very convenient for me, though. Shame it's only useful for powering items," Kale said. "Having some kind of personal mana battery would have been a nice way of sidestepping your limited mana reserves. Have you looked into making such a thing? Even if it only lasted a few weeks, that should be enough to be useful in your circumstances." "Of course I've looked into it," Zorian scoffed. "It's impossible. Personal mana loses its affinity with its maker rapidly once expended, becoming indistinguishable from ambient mana in a matter of minutes." "Oh. Indeed. What about alchemical solutions? Is there a potion that increases your mana regeneration, gives you a momentary mana boost or something like that?" "I doubt it. I think we would have all heard about such a potion if it was at all available. But it's possible, I suppose, especially if it has some serious drawbacks that curtails its use. You should probably ask Lukav about that. If anyone knows how to answer that question definitively, it's him," Kale said. He squirmed uncomfortably. "And since we're on the topic of Lukav, I have a bit of a personal request." "I'm listening," Zorian said curiously. "Okay," Kale began. "When I gave you that list of people to consult with in regards to soul magic, I did not exactly give you a list of strangers. We weren't best friends, but I knew these people. We had history between us, we met sometimes to exchange news and the like. To find out that someone had been going around kidnapping and killing them was very upsetting to me." Zorian winced. Now that it was pointed out to him, he had been really rather callous when he told Kale of the disappearances in Nyazovdvary, hadn't he? This wasn't just another disquieting mystery to Kale, but an outright attack on him and his acquaintances. I'm not angry at you, Kale hurriedly added. I realize you already have a lot on your plate and that staying alive and figuring out what is behind the time loop takes precedence over everything else. However, I would really appreciate it if you looked into these killers and figured out a way to stop them for good. Of course, Zorian immediately agreed. I had fully intended to do so anyway. I simply delayed that investigation until I had taken care of more pressing problems and gotten somewhat better at magical combat. Besides, he had figured that investigating the invasion forces here in Cyoria would automatically bring him closer to solving that particular mystery. The two were clearly connected somehow, perhaps even two different fronts of the exact same operation. I see. That takes a load off my chest, Kale said, exhaling heavily. If there is anything I can do to help you with this, just let me know. I'm still in the process of asking around, but I think I can get my hands on a couple of truth potion recipes. I already have my own interrogation magic, but I suppose having more options to choose from never hurts, Zorian said. Truthfully, truth potions might actually be more effective than what he had in mind, at least at the current stage of the investigation, but he really needed to develop his ability to sift through people's memories, so he was reluctant to use them. Keep in mind that Lukav already knows how to make a truth potion, so if your talks fall through I can just teleport you to his village so you can have a friendly chat with him. Perhaps he is willing to share. He knows how to do that. Sneaky bastard was holding out on me, Kale grumbled. Still, that does remind me that Lukav is far from being a helpless victim and neither is his priest friend. It might be a good idea to involve them in the investigation. They might be perfectly capable of taking the killers down on their own if you provide him with sufficient information. Now there was an idea. It would be hard to secure Alanix's cooperation without coming clean about absolutely everything, but the benefits could be immense. He would have to seriously consider it when he started to seriously tackle the problem of Ayaska Manor and disappearances around Nyazovdvary. Well, said Kale after a few seconds of silence, unlocking one of the drawers attached to his work desk and withdrawing a cheap, featureless notebook out of it. With that out of the way, I'd like to discuss another unpleasant topic with you. Your soul marker. Zorian straightened his back a little, suddenly alert. Truthfully, when he had told Kale about the soul marker and allowed the Morlock boy to perform a scan of his soul, he had not expected much. Kale may have been a necromancer, but he was very much an amateur one. Still, he figured it wouldn't hurt to put some trust in the other boy. Both Lukav and Alanik were rather narrowly specialized when it came to their soul magic expertise, and it was entirely possible that they had missed something that a full-blown necromancer, even a novice one, would find obvious. It seemed that was indeed the case. What is it? He asked with barely hidden excitement. Kale sighed and pressed the notebook into Zorian's hand. Leafing through it, however, Zorian realized he didn't understand anything in it. It was full of unfamiliar diagrams and alien jargon, interspersed with brief paragraphs that meant nothing to one who lacked sufficient context to understand them. He shot Kale an annoyed look. I'll be blunt, said Kale, ignoring his glare. Your marker shouldn't work. Seeing Zorian's confused expression, he moved to explain. I was immediately suspicious when you described how tightly the markers entwined with your soul. Why would someone make such a deeply embedded marker and then make it a simple unchanging identification stamp like you assumed it was? The desire to make the marker resilient to damage and harder to remove could explain some of it, but it was still excessive. There are less invasive means that would have only failed if the soul was so mangled that the person was effectively dead. Those methods do have a noticeable flaw, though. They are a lot easier to copy than what you have rooted in your soul. That, I felt, was key. The marker was designed to foil attempts at copying it to other people. And in order to do that, it needed to check up on the host soul to see whether it has been transplanted to another person, Zorian interrupted. Yes, Kale said. He took the notebook out of Zorian's hands, flipped it to one of the later pages and handed it back to him. Looking at it again, Zorian could tell that the diagram was supposed to be a crude outline of a human's body, several circles, triangles and straight lines drawn over it. Below it was a short paragraph talking about essence channels, feedback nodes and transition barriers. It still didn't mean much to Zorian, but he could tell this time that it was supposed to represent Zorian's soul, the marker attached to it and their interaction to one another. I do not claim to completely understand the marker, Kale said. Or even most of it, It's an awe-inspiring thing clearly made by a master soul mage. I especially like how it makes itself inconspicuous to casual soul scans. I'm not surprised I never detected it before being informed it was there. Still, there are some things about its functions that are obvious to me, and one of them is that the marker is designed to consult the soul of its host, the core, unchanging part of it, anyway, and alter its identification tag according to what it detects. Transplanting the marker to another person should result in a totally different identification value. But that's clearly not how it works, Zorian protested. Zack and I have the same damn marker. The tracking spell wouldn't have worked otherwise. It's broken, Kale said calmly. Your marker, that is. There are parts of it that are totally inert, either because they do not acknowledge you as its rightful host or because they are missing some critical piece that got lost in the transfer. I'm guessing that at least one of those is supposed to send a signal to the looping mechanism when you die, terminating the loop prematurely. That would neatly explain why you get sent back when Zack dies, but he doesn't experience the same when you end up dead. He has the intact version of the marker, whereas you don't. But the main part of the thing works? In a sense. It does everything it is supposed to, consulting the core of your soul, but for some reason it is still stuck on the same value it had while it was still inside Zack. It's broken, but it's broken in your favor. Huh, said Zorian lamely. What was he supposed to say to that? Honestly, this isn't such a huge surprise. I always suspected that the marker was in some way defective. After all, I highly doubt that its makers intended for someone like me to enter the time loop the way I did. Does this really change anything? Depends how you look at it, Kale said. You are in no danger of being suddenly dropped out of the loop, so I suppose from a personal perspective this doesn't change much. But look at it from a wider perspective. If I'm right, then whatever convergence of circumstances aligned to pull you into the time loop along with Zack was a fluke. A fortunate fluke, but a fluke all the same. It is not consistently reproducible. Zorian frowned. What was he? Then it hit him. Wait. How did Red Robe end up time looping then? Yes, that is the question, isn't it? Kale said, his fingers drumming on his work table impatiently. I'm afraid I don't know how to answer that question. But he clearly didn't use the same method you did. Yeah, Zorian agreed. I had strongly suspected that, but I couldn't be sure. Him having some other method of joining the time loop would explain why he never used his own marker to track me down the way I did Zack. He doesn't have the same marker as me and Zack if he indeed has one at all, so he would have to capture Zack and use him as a key to locate me that way. And if he's indeed a master soul mage like you seem to think, he probably knows you could not possibly have an identical marker as Zack. So there is no reason for him to try that in the first place, Kale said. They bounced theories and ideas off one another for the next half an hour. But it was all just hollow speculation at the moment. They had no way to confirm or discard any of the possibilities. Kale thought that Red Robe was in some way piggybacking on Zack, either by leaving portions of his mind in Zack the way the Cyorrian matriarch did with Zorian, or by having some kind of soul link with Zack. Zorian discarded the possibility of a mind package immediately. The logistics of that kind of setup didn't add up. Red Robe was active within hours of the start of the loop. If his quick arrival to the ruins of the Arania colony in that one restart were any indication, and processing a large amount of memories took more than a day. Not to mention that Zack didn't start every restart by going to the same location, so it was questionable how Red Robe would have even gotten a memory package in every restart. No, Red Robe definitely wasn't using memory packages. And really, Zorian didn't think he was linked to Zack's soul either. If he was, he would have checked Zack's soul for additional connections when he'd read his mind and found out there were additional time travelers running around. Instead, he immediately ran off to confront the Arania. The thought of someone being connected to Zack's soul didn't seem to occur to him. Personally, Zorian thought Red Robe did have a marker of some sort. It was entirely possible he felt that there was a way for people who knew what they were doing to enter the time loop properly, to get their own marker and all. Though that did raise a question about why he didn't just off Zack and go on with his life free of interference. What was so special about Zack? Right. I don't think we're getting anywhere with this, Zorian said. Anything else I should keep in mind? Nothing that Lukav and his priest friend didn't already warn you about. Avoid any magic that could alter your soul substantially. We don't know what caused the marker to get stuck on its current identification value, and there is no telling what will push it off the edge, so take care, said Kale. I was afraid to do that even before now, and for that exact reason too, Zorian said, leaning back on making a deliberately dramatic sigh. Pity though. I guess my dream of turning that stupid Grey Hunter Silverlake sent me to deal with into my very own familiar or becoming a Grey Hunter shifter is doomed to remain just a dream. Didn't you know? There is a reason why most shifters are made from normal animals, Kale warned him. Being a shifter means you get instincts from the other part of the soul, and magical creatures always have very strong souls. The more magical the creature, the stronger. And they tend to be extremely violent and territorial. With regards to Grey Hunters, I'm fairly certain they don't tolerate even their own kind, much less anything else. Such an attitude would bleed over to you if you became a Grey Hunter shifter. And there is also the matter of inheritance to consider. Even if you are able to master a Grey Hunter's soul and not let its urges rule you, there is no guarantee that your children will be similarly strong-willed, especially since they'll have those urges from the day they are born. I'd strongly recommend against that course of action. As for making it your familiar, keep in mind that it takes a long time for the soul link to mature and that you need to be close to it the whole time. There is no guarantee that the creature won't kill you during the process. And if you do manage to slave it to your will, it could still be dangerous to everyone around you who is not protected by the soul bond. There was no need for a lecture. I was just joking, said Zorian flatly. Good. Even if its abilities would have been so very useful, Zorian said wistfully. Extreme toughness, speed and magical resistance? Yes please. Just kill it, chop it up for parts and make an enhancement potion out of them, suggested Kale. You can ask Lukav to help you do it, I'm sure he'd jump at the chance. Not many people are crazy enough to go after one of those monsters after all, so I'm pretty sure he never had a chance to work with Grey Hunter parts. You know, that actually sounds like an interesting idea. Glad I could help, Kale said, peering into a slowly bubbling metal pot on the table in front of him and scowling. Well, my current experiment is not going too well. And I thought I had it this time too. Time to try batch number 4. He gave Zorian a speculative look. Say, do you think you can help me out here? Some of the steps are pretty simple, and observing my work will ensure you don't forget what I talked about as easily as you did last time. Yeah, I'll help, and holy gods, will you stop reminding me of that? Zorian whined. It was more than a year and I had a lot on my mind. It was natural I would forget a lot of things. Besides, I'm already working on sidestepping my faulty memory somehow. I wish you luck about that, Kale said. Nonetheless, we both know you'll remember my work a lot better if you understand what I'm doing instead of just blindly memorizing recipes and dry instructions. Think of this as free alchemical lessons. Well, he did use a fair amount of alchemy in solving the problems he encountered, so getting some advice in the field might actually be useful. All right. Where do you want me to start? Break. The next day, Zorian decided to make good on his own internal promise to find some solution to that forgetting things problem. Well, he had to organize another one of Kiriel's magic lessons first, but there were no issues with that. Her progress was much faster than it had been in the previous restarts he had tried teaching her, since he had already been through this several times and was therefore getting better at motivating her and explaining the subject matter in a way she intuitively understood. His obligations done for the day, he quickly excused himself and went out for a walk, lest Kale or Amaya find some other job to dump in his lap. In the long run, Zorian knew he already had a perfectly good solution for remembering things with perfect clarity. He could just make memory packets like those of the Cyorrian matriarch, storing them in his mind for future recall. The map of Cyoria's underworld that the matriarch had left him was still as crystal clear in his mind as it had been the day he had assembled it from the scattered remnants left in the minds of the male survivors of the colony. It served as a shining example of what was possible for one who could master the procedure of creating such things. And it wasn't like learning how to do that would be an additional time sink, either. Learning how to handle memory packets was something he was already working on. It was his current priority, in fact. The problem was, it would be a while before his effort there bore any fruit. Could be a couple of months, could be a couple of years. Well, hopefully not years, since the matriarch's memory package could decay into uselessness by then, but the point remained, it was not a quick solution to his immediate problem. Fortunately, human mages were quite good at making quick solutions to immediate problems, and surely some of them had at one point needed to memorize a map down to the very last detail, or recite a book word for word. Zorian would be shocked if the spell to do such a thing didn't already exist somewhere out there. It was just a question of whether he could find it. He decided to try at the Academy Library first. A bit unimaginative, but it was the best place to start his research, and it had been a while since he'd spent some time browsing its shelves. He kind of missed that during his long absence from Cyoria. 3 hours later, he was torn between smiling in satisfaction and the urge to find something flammable to take his frustration out on. The bright side was, he found what he was looking for. There were no less than 5 different spells that could do what he wanted, mostly by allowing the caster to record what they see and hear for a brief period of time and storing that record in their minds. They differed in details such as whether it was possible to pause the recording or not, but the core was the same. One even claimed it could form a clear memory retroactively, allowing the caster to remember what they had forgotten. The bad news was that these spells were only available in the restricted section of the library. Specifically, the mind magic section of it. Zorian leaned back in his chair, precariously balancing it on its back 2 legs and taking his glasses off to massage his eyes. To say that the Academy was reluctant to give permission to random students with regards to doing mind magic would be a severe understatement. He needed a better library pass if he wanted to get what he wanted, and there was no way he was going to get it through legal means. He narrowed his eyes while staring at the library ceiling. There was no helping it. He would just have to steal one. What has gotten my best student so gloomy on this fine day? Zorian jumped in his seat, startled, the poorly balanced chair almost giving up on him and pulling him to the floor. After finally stabilizing himself enough, he turned around to give Ilsa an unamused look. Sorry, she said, but her smile and the emotions he felt off of her told Zorian she was not sorry at all. I didn't think you would react so explosively. You just surprised me a bit, Zorian said. He had detected a person passing by him with his mind sense, but that wasn't exactly something unusual in this place. It wasn't like the library was empty after all. What can I help you with, Miss Salati? Nothing really, I am already done with what I came here for. You didn't notice it because you were so absorbed into your reading, but I had passed through this section twice before now. I just didn't want to interrupt you then since you looked quite busy. I was just leaving now when I noticed you trying to burn a hole in the ceiling with your eyes, so I wondered if I can help you with whatever is troubling you. I appreciate the offer, Miss Salati, Zorian said. I really do. But I don't think you can help me with this. Helpful though she may be, Zorian was pretty sure that asking her to help him with committing a crime was a terrible idea. Amusing but terrible. What are you working on anyway? She asked, peering at the open book in front of him. Memory preservation spells? Why would you need that? I need a way to quickly and flawlessly memorize a notebook or two, Zorian said truthfully. Ilsa gave him a searching look. If this is about classwork. No, I think I'm doing quite well in my classes, Zorian said, shaking his head. If anything, he thought he was doing too well. He was at the top of his class in terms of grades, despite his efforts to avoid standing out. It's personal. All I can say is that I'll be going on a trip soon, and I won't be able to bring anything with me. Anything but my memories, that is. And while my memory is quite good, it is not good enough to memorize, say, a word-for-word transcription of a book of potion recipes. Sounds ominous and suspicious, Ilsa noted. I'm not planning anything illegal, Zorian assured. I'm sure, Ilsa deadpanned. That's why you're looking up spells that I know you're not authorized to learn. Hence me being gloomy when you approached me, Zorian countered. I'd thought I had found a solution to my problem, but it turns out it's beyond my reach at the moment. I see, she said. Out of curiosity, how important is it that you be able to access the information in the book while it is stored inside your mind? I'm not sure I understand, Zorian frowned. What would be the point of holding a book in your head if you couldn't read it? To create a copy of it, of course, Ilsa smiled. It's a trick that some alteration experts use if they want to be able to create complex objects without carrying the originals with them. They use a spell to record the blueprint of an object, storing it inside their heads, then simply use that blueprint to create copies of the object whenever it strikes their fancy. Well, provided they have the correct raw materials. In your case, that would be a blank book of similar dimensions to what you're trying to copy and a bottle of ink. And, you know how to do this? Asked Zorian hopefully. Ilsa hummed. Well, I am an alteration expert. But even if I was willing to teach you, this is not exactly an easy spell combination. It requires a great deal of alteration expertise and great shaping control. It would take dash. Zorian concentrated for a second and pulled at the heavy metal-lined book on the shelf next to him with his magic, not bothering to make a single gesture or hand motion. The book smoothly slid out of its shelf and floated in front of Ilsa, startling her. Before she could say anything, the book opened itself and started turning its pages, slowly at first but then speeding up until the last half of it passed in a blur and the book slammed itself shut. His point made, Zorian smoothly slotted the book back to its previous place on the shelf. "I can't think of a proper way to prove my alteration expertise right now," said Zorian in the resulting silence, "but I'm perfectly capable of restructuring a metal pan into a fully functional metal watch." "How much harder would this be compared to that?" "Not exactly harder," Ilsa admitted, still staring at the book on the shelf with a frown. "But certainly different. You'd have to practice for a few days before you can get it right." She shook her head and tore her eyes away from the book to stare Zorian in the eyes. "We're going to have a talk about this on Monday, Mr. Kaczynski. Does that mean you agree to teach it to me?" he asked. "Not yet. I'll need to run some tests on you to see whether you can handle the spells safely." Ilsa soon left, leaving Zorian alone to his own thoughts. He closed the book in front of him, setting it aside. Ilsa's spell combination wasn't exactly what he had been looking for when he searched for a quick and dirty solution, but it could work. In fact, it was even better than his original idea in some regards. Much less annoying to use, for instance. Plus, he wouldn't need to painstakingly transcribe the information from his head every time he wanted to add or change something. He would give Ilsa's method a chance. But he was going to steal a better library pass anyway. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Most of it was routine, like him accompanying Taven and her team to the dungeon, teaching Kiriel or helping Kale with his alchemy, and having his soul occasionally scanned by the other boy with little results thus far. It helped that Kiriel actually had a friend her age this time, so she monopolized his time a lot less. Whatever dark secret her mother harbored, Zorian had to admit Notchka's presence made Kiriel a lot more manageable than she usually was, so he was definitely going to visit that bridge in future restarts as well. 2 main things stood out from the rest. The first one was that he had managed to learn the spells Ilsa had talked about, and they worked just as she said they would. He was happy that he could finally keep written notes on what happened in the time loop, since he now had a method of effectively transferring his notebooks into the next restart. Kale was happy too, since he could now be much more liberal about the amount of information he was sending over to his future self. He promptly gave Zorian 4 fully filled out notebooks to store the blueprints of, with a promise of 1 more by the end of the restart. Zorian really hoped Kale wouldn't accumulate notebooks so rapidly in future restarts, because Zorian could only hold about 15 blueprints in his mind. The matriarch's memory packet didn't leave much room for anything else, really. The second interesting thing was that he had all but confirmed that Svim had his mind shielded at all times. He had barged into the man's office 3 different times, and the shield had always been active. Sadly, his unannounced visit seemed to have finally provoked the unflappable man somewhat, so now Zorian had 5 different shaping books on his reading list for their next session. Depending on which book Svim decided to focus on, their next lesson would consist of Zorian making detailed shapes out of sand, telekinetically dismantling a watch without breaking any of its parts, playing around with candles and matches, trying to apply paint on canvas without using any brushes, or carving glyphs into stones with his fingers. Or maybe all 5 if Svim was feeling particularly vindictive. But that was all background activity. The real focus of his efforts was tracking the Abasins and the Cult of the World Dragon, mapping the structure of their organization. Originally he wanted to be cautious, spending most of the restart just observing everything, identifying their members and locations they met and did business in, but, well, he saw his chance and he took it. While the Abasins were mostly full-blown mages and lived deep underground in heavily warded bases crawling with guards, only periodically visiting the surface, most of their allies in the city were far more modestly protected. Zorian followed around cultists and simple mercenaries that worked with the Abasins, tracking them down to their homes and reading their thoughts as they skulked around. The wards on their houses, if they even had them, were hilariously easy to avoid or break, allowing Zorian to root through their stuff for additional clues and connections with other members of their conspiracy. He had found out some interesting things. For instance, not all of the Abasin agents in the city were aware of what they were getting themselves into. The various merchants that smuggled food and other supplies to the invaders seemed entirely ignorant of whom they were really supporting. It was just business to them. Apparently there were numerous secret bases and operations happening in the deep reaches of Sioria's dungeon, and most of them were fairly inoffensive, illegal harvesting operations for dangerous substances, secret research facilities by various trading groups, even a government black site of some sort. The merchants thought they were simply supplying one of these many shadowy factions and never pried much into the identity of their customers. A couple of mercenaries knew that the invaders planned to do some kind of terrorist strike during the summer festival, but didn't care about the details so long as they got paid. They didn't seem to be aware of the true scale of the invasion. Then there was the cult of the World Dragon, who honestly baffled him. The cult had a very complex, confusing structure with lots of different ranks and categories of membership, and every rank seemed to have been fed a different story. On top of that, some members seemed to be in it purely for the benefits and had never bought into the cult's belief system in the first place. They were in it for the money. Apparently, being a member of the Cult of Dragon could be pretty profitable if you played your cards right. They knew that the cult planned to release a primordial at the summer festival to ravage the city and everything around it, of course, but didn't believe the primordial in question even existed, so no harm in going along with it, right? Right. There was still no evidence that Red Robe was in any way operating among the invasion forces, nor that he had shared even a speck of knowledge with them before running off to do something else. So Zorian decided to be a little more aggressive and start actually practicing his memory reading on acceptable targets. To that end, he identified a small cultist gathering, organized by a trio of magic-wielding members who appeared to be of a slightly higher rank than the usual dregs Zorian encountered thus far, and prepared to subdue them for questioning. 8 armed cultists, 3 of whom were magic wielders. His old self would have called him crazy for trying to tackle them all on his lonesome, even from ambush, but they never really stood a chance. He trapped the house they were to meet in before they even got there, having found out about their chosen meeting place several days in advance, and took them down one by one as they came. Mostly by telepathically compelling them into falling asleep, much like the Arania had tried to do to him such a long time ago when he'd first encountered them. The last arrival was a mage who had a mind shield spell formula on a ring and fought his attempt off. Zorian was forced to deal with him via slamming him into a wall a couple of times with some judicious application of the Force Blast spell. Once they were all down and tied up, Zorian took a deep breath and concentrated on diving into the memories of his first victim. Before he got instruction from the Yellow Cavern Guardians, Zorian sort of expected that probing someone's memories would be like one sometimes sees in adventure novels and the like, a walk through some psychedelic mindscape, where the intruder has to navigate deeply symbolical mazes and fight mental representations of the victim's psyche and whatnot. The reality was nothing like that. Or at least the way Arania did it was nothing like that, and the Yellow Cavern Guardians had seemed more than a little amused when Zorian had described the idea to them. Instead, memory probes simply consisted of a powerful telepathic probe that punched through the surface layers of the victim's mind and then started branching throughout their inner self in search of whatever the psychic was after. It was by its very nature a dangerous procedure. Unlike lighter surface manipulations, deep scans like the one he was about to do could permanently ruin a mind. An amateur like Zorian was all but guaranteed to cause irreparable damage on his first try, unless they had spent years doing careful exercises which Zorian had no time for. Thus, he was not terribly surprised when that first man ended up as a mindless husk 5 minutes later. The convulsions and foaming at the mouth that preceded it were very disturbing, however, and almost made him give up on the whole thing right then and there. He didn't even manage to read anything out of his memories, so his death had been for nothing. A few minutes later, after he'd had some time to calm down and drown out the little voice in his head telling him he was a monster for killing a defenseless man like that, he continued with victim number 2. He decided not to stay so long inside the minds of the rest of them. Number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 survived his probes. They could even wake up someday. Well, they could have if the time loop wasn't so close to its end. The 6th attempt actually yielded some results, too. He didn't find much in the man's memories before he had to withdraw, but he did add a few more names to his list to investigate, so at least some good came out of it. The last 2 suffered only light damage due to his probe. They knew nothing useful that could help him. Zorian left the house feeling hollow, wondering whether he was really justified in doing this. He came home to find Kiriel in tears and the entire household in an uproar. Ray and Saw Satchel had been found dead in their home, brutally murdered by what appeared to be a monster missed by the many extermination squads operating in the city by now. Of their daughter there was no trace. Chapter 040. Shifting Tracks. Zorian woke up very early in the morning, roused from his slumber by the faint, incoherent mumbling of Kiriel sleeping beside him. For a moment he wondered why Kiriel was sleeping in his bed instead of being in her own room, But then he snapped out of the confused half-dream state he was in, and memories of the previous evening came rushing into him. Ray and her husband were dead, their daughter missing. An event that had completely blindsided Zorian, who had never heard of anything like that happening in the previous restarts. Was this something that usually happened and he just never heard of it, or did the many changes in the wake of the Iranian destruction somehow cause this? That fact that Ray and Saw had been killed by a wandering monster seemed to suggest the latter. But Zorian had a hunch there was nothing random about that monster attack. The cephalic rats had been monitoring the Sashal household for a reason after all, and the invaders were ever so fond of slaving dungeon denizens to their will and using them as their attack dogs. Kiriel, of course, neither knew nor cared about Zorian's musings on the matter. Unlike him, who was not terribly close to the Sashal family and for whom their deaths would in no way be permanent, Kiriel had gotten very close to Nochka and was devastated to hear about the attack. Not even pointing out that she may still be alive could get her to stop crying. After all, the police said her parents were killed by a dungeon denizen, and those weren't exactly known for kidnapping people and keeping them alive for ransom. In the end, Kiriel only calmed down and went to sleep when Amaya gave her some homemade calming tea that kicked in suspiciously quickly. Probably a mild opiate. He should have asked for a cup of that himself in all likelihood. He had already been rather unnerved by his experience of reading the cultist's memories, and was thus ill-equipped to deal with this brand new crisis. Moving slowly, Zorian carefully extricated himself out of his bed and vacated the room, trying not to wake up Kiriel. He was pretty sure he failed in that regard, as her mental signature abruptly got more active about halfway through his retreat from the room, but since she never said anything and kept her eyes closed, he figured she didn't want to talk to him yet. Or maybe she just wanted to go back to sleep. It was pretty early. He found everyone else already awake and seated around the table when he entered the kitchen. Amaya, Kale, and even Kana. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Kale asked rhetorically. Kiriel snuck into my bed in the middle of the night, said Zorian with a sigh. She's hard to bunk with even in normal circumstances and considering the recent events. Poor thing, Amaya said. She was hit the hardest by this, I think. It's a disgrace that something like that could happen in the middle of the city, and after it was already known that monsters were getting unusually aggressive too. Amaya spent the next 10 minutes or so blaming the city for poor handling of the monster crisis, a subject that she never showed all that much of an interest in before now. It didn't take an empath to figure out that Kiriel wasn't the only one greatly affected by the killings. She had probably formed a friendship with Ray during the many times she had brought Nochka to meet with Kiriel. Kale and Kana, on the other hand, seemed far less affected. Kale had virtually no interaction with either Nochka or Ray and had never even met Saw, so that was understandable. Kana had sometimes joined Nochka and Kiriel in their games, but had been nowhere near as close to Nochka as Kiriel had. She was also very young and probably didn't quite understand what was happening. Eventually Amaya ran out of steam and fell silent, though Zorian could still feel a lot of frustration coming off her. An uneasy atmosphere descended on the table. Oh yes, Amaya said suddenly. I forgot to tell you yesterday, but the police want to talk to you about Ray and her family. Me? Asked Zorian in surprise. What would I know about that? You did speak to Ray and her husband relatively recently, pointed out Kale. They probably want to see if they told you something of importance. Most likely they want to talk to everyone who knew the victim. I see, Zorian said, idly drumming his fingers on the table. Are they going to drop by at some point, or should I go visit the police station? Detective Exceteri said he was going to be at the Sashal residence at noon today, and that you should meet him there if possible, Amaya said. Zorian frowned. Exceteri? That sounded familiar. Where did he? Oh, his old divination teacher had that last name too, didn't he? And he was a detective too. This Detective Exceteri, he wouldn't be named Haslush, would he? Asked Zorian. I think that was his name, yes, Amaya said, frowning. I have to say I don't really remember his introduction all that well. I was too shocked to really pay attention. Why do you know him? I've heard of him, said Zorian. It's not really important, I was just curious. I'll go give him a visit later. At that point Kiriel trudged into the kitchen, apparently having decided not to go back to sleep after all, and they all wordlessly decided to shelve the topic of the Sashal family for the moment. Break. The Sashal family home didn't look like a scene of death. That was the first thing Zorian noticed when he approached the house. He had expected to see some kind of damage on the building, broken windows, the door torn off its hinges, maybe a damaged wall section. But the house looked entirely intact. If it weren't for the trio of policemen hanging around the entrance and giving him severe looks as he approached, he would have never guessed the occupants had been killed. Didn't look much like a monster attack to him. The chance of this being an actual random event kept getting lower and lower. "I'm here to speak to Detective etc." he said to the tall, mustachioed, stern-looking policeman that looked like he was the leader of the group in front of him. "He told me I should look for him here. Is he present?" "He's inside," the man nodded. "But I'm afraid I can't let you go look for him yourself. If you are willing to wait a little, I will notify him you're here." "I'm fine with that," said Zorian, though internally he wasn't happy. He had wanted to take a look inside the place to see if he could spot any clues. He doubted the police would be willing to tell him any details about the killings after all. Inconvenient. He could just wait until they left the place alone and sneak in then, but that might take several days. Most of the clues would have gone cold by then, assuming they hadn't been confiscated by the police as evidence. Besides, there wasn't all that much time left before the end of the restart, so his window of opportunity to conduct an investigation was very small. Damn it, he so didn't need this right now. "Wait here then," the mustachioed policeman said. "What is your name, boy?" Zorian gave him his name and the man promptly disappeared through the door to fetch Haslush. After 5 minutes of waiting in uncomfortable silence while the other two policemen gave him suspicious looks, however, he could tell it would take a while for the man to return. Zorian shuffled in place uncomfortably, probably looking mightily suspicious to the two policemen scrutinizing his every move. He knew it wasn't entirely rational, but he was profoundly unnerved about being so close to law enforcement. Logically speaking, they had no reason to suspect him of anything, and this entire talk was likely just a formality. He'd had bad dealings with the police back in Siren though, and he was also dealing with Haslush. His old teacher could be scarily perceptive at times. Zorian wouldn't put it past the man to notice something strange about him and bring him in for more detailed questioning, which would be a gigantic waste of time at best, and at worst would necessitate an early end to the restart via suicide. He'd prefer to avoid the latter possibility at all costs. Kiriel was already devastated about losing a friend, so having her brother suddenly blow himself up in the police station all of a sudden would be terrible. True, Zorian wouldn't be there to see her anguish and the restart would end a few days later, but just imagining the possibility made him ill. Maybe he should read Haslush's mind? Haslush was probably trained in detecting and resisting mental intrusion, being a mage working for law enforcement and all, but Zorian's particular brand of mind magic was very non-standard. He didn't use any obvious chants and gestures, so maybe he could get away with it. It would probably answer a lot of questions and would allow him to avoid any obvious blunders while talking to him. But no, that was too much of a risk. Besides, he had a much better target for something like that standing just beside him. He doubted those mundane policemen were trained in dealing with mind magic, beyond maybe being given a few pointers. A secret is only as strong as its weakest links. He proceeded to worm his way into the two policemen's thoughts. He found out that they were really not as interested in him as he had been imagining, but they also weren't thinking about the Satchel family either. One of them was hungry and thinking of the dinner his wife was making him back home, and the other was fantasizing about some female administrative employee back in the station. Well, that was okay, he would talk to them and lead their thoughts back to the situation at hand. "So, I don't want to get you gentlemen in trouble or anything, but is there anything you can tell me about what happened here? Saw and Ray had been friends of mine and I was shocked to hear what happened to them. Is there anything you can tell me about all this?" Zorian didn't really expect them to say much. He fully expected them to give him the silent treatment until Haslush got outside, but simply mentioning the topic was usually enough to get a person to start thinking about it. He didn't expect to be hit by a veritable wave of distrust and derisiveness coming from his link to one of the policemen though. And he looked like such a normal-looking kid too, the man thought to himself. I'd never have guessed he was hanging around a bunch of thieving cat shifters. Just shows you can never trust outward appearances when it comes to magic bullshit. Ray was a cat shifter? That made a lot of sense, actually explained some things. What he didn't understand at all was that the policeman seemed to think this made Ray and her family bad people. So much so that Zorian was apparently bad just for associating with them. Apparently he had physically reacted to this revelation, because the other policeman noticed it and spoke up to forestall any possible unpleasantness. He didn't seem to see Zorian's reaction as any evidence of mind reading, chalking up his reaction to him being able to sense the change in his partner's bearing and facial expression. "We're just here to look tough and discourage curious neighbors from snooping around, kid," the other policeman said. "We don't know anything more about this than you do in all likelihood. Some sort of dungeon creature made its way into the house and killed the couple inside. For anything more you'll have to wait for Officer Kalen to come back with the detective." The first policeman lightly shook his head before catching himself and stopping. The creature that killed them simply sauntered in through an unlocked door instead of breaking in and attacked absolutely no one else in this entire crowded neighborhood. "If that was an actual monster incursion, I will eat my own shoes," the man thought to himself. "The kiddies probably stuck their noses in some shady business like usual and got offed for it when someone took offense. Gods know they got their paws on everything these days." Zorian frowned. "What about Nochka? Their daughter? I was told her body was never recovered and that she might still be alive." The two policemen suddenly became very uncomfortable. Even the first one, who clearly didn't like cat shifters as a whole, felt bad about the little girl who reminded him of his own daughter. Neither of them thought there was much chance of Nochka ever being found again, but they were unsurprisingly unwilling to tell this to Zorian and instead tried to think of a suitable non-answer they could give him. They both breathed a sigh of relief when their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of their mustachioed friend who exited the house with Hazlush in tow. Hazlush, for his part, decided to lead Zorian on a walk away from the house, ruining his plan to keep mind reading the mundane policeman while they talked for additional clues. It might be for the better, actually. Paying attention to two different thought streams at the same time had already been rather hard. Trying to have a conversation with Hazlush while doing the same would have probably been impossible. "So Zorian. I can call you Zorian, right?" Hazlush asked. Zorian nodded, aware that the man had a massive dislike for formality. "Right. I'm guessing Miss Kuroshka has told you what happened back there, but just so we're clear, Ray and Saw Satchel were found dead in their home yesterday morning, along with the mangled corpses of 2 giant centipedes. Their daughter was nowhere to be found and nobody has heard anything about her since. Any of that news to you?" "Mr. Tveranov and Miss Kuroshka already told me most of that, but not the part about the mangled centipedes," said Zorian. "Yes, well, your younger sibling reacted so badly to the news that I censored myself a little. Called it a monster attack rather than dwelling on the details." Hazlush shrugged. "I apologize for upsetting her so much. I'm told I can be a little tactless at times, but it's a hard trait to lose. This line of work tends to make you more than a little bit morbid, and I sometimes forget most people aren't exposed to death and crime every waking moment of their lives." Zorian thought about assuaging the man's worry and assuring him he didn't hold a grudge about that, but then figured the man would be more willing to share information with him if he appeared guilty, so he remained silent. Instead, he shifted the topic back to the killings. "So they were killed by giant centipedes?" asked Zorian. "I didn't see any damage outside the house. How did they get in?" "Through the door. Apparently the occupants had left it unlocked." Zorian gave Hazlush an incredulous look. "I'm just telling you what we found," Hazlush said defensively. "I know this case is strange, it's why we haven't pronounced it closed and moved on. And on that note, is there anything you could tell me about the Satchel family that would explain what happened to them?" Of course he did. But nothing he could tell the man without getting himself in trouble. He told Hazlush everything he had figured out about the apparent cat shifters through his interactions with them, but this was very sketchy information, and based on Hazlush's unhappy expression probably wasn't anything new to the detective. Not that surprising. Amaya alone had probably told him everything Zorian just did and then some. "This wasn't really a monster attack, was it?" Zorian asked. Hazlush gave Zorian a piercing look, which Zorian met unflinchingly. After a few seconds, Hazlush withdrew a hip flask from his jacket, took a long, deep sip from it and then put it back into his jacket pocket. "No, probably not," he admitted. "Why were they targeted and by whom, if you don't mind me asking?" Zorian said, trying his luck. "Hey, who knows? Maybe the man would even answer." "Well, no. If I knew that, I wouldn't be speaking to you now, would I?" Hazlush pointed out. "So you have no leads," Zorian concluded. "I have too many leads," Hazlush corrected. "The Satchels? Well, how much do you really know about them? I presume you're talking about them being cat shifters?" Zorian guessed. "Ah, so you do know about that. I've been wondering about that. The rest of your housemates didn't seem aware of that fact, but Amaya said you were unreasonably suspicious of Ray right from the start." Well, if you know what they are, then you surely know why this could be any number of things. I don't actually, said Zorian, shaking his head in denial. I was suspicious about Ray because she looked suspicious and I am a paranoid person. Them being cat shifters never factored into it, and to be frank, I know virtually nothing about them. What's the deal with cat shifters anyway? Bluntly put, most cat shifters are heavily involved with crime, Haslush said. Theft, smuggling and spying usually, but occasionally even assassination. Their alternate forms are tailor-made for such shady activities after all. Cats are small, stealthy animals whose presence is hardly ever notable in and of itself. How many new never-seen-them-before cats do you see in a week? A lot. Right. In a big city like this, unfamiliar cats are ubiquitous. Few things threaten them aside from humans, and most humans don't hurt cats without reason. And on top of that, shifters get the ability to access traits of their animal form even while they're human, meaning cat shifters get things like night vision, a sense of smell powerful enough to put most dogs to shame, superior balance and agility, and a whole bunch of other benefits. I'm still a bit surprised this lets them be so active in crime, said Zorian. You'd think the sheer flexibility of classical mages employed by the various police forces would allow them to shut down a shifter group operating like that, regardless of their special abilities. But you're assuming cat shifters work alone, which is not the case at all. They are hands down the most firmly assimilated shifter type of them all. They live in cities and towns among ordinary people, and are virtually indistinguishable from a normal human on casual inspection. Everything a regular citizen could do, cat shifters can as well. In particular, this means they have no problems in getting classical magic of their own. Hell, their links to crime mean they can get their hands on many things an average mage can't, like permanent enhancement rituals or illegal spells for evading notice and influencing people. Do you have any evidence that Ray and her family were that type of cat shifter though? Zorian frowned. Maybe I'm naive, but they didn't look like that to me. Surely there are non-criminal cat shifters. There are, Haslush nodded. And every single cat shifter would have you believe they're one of them. Considering what happened, I don't think I'm willing to put much stock in the Sashel family being such counterexamples. Half an hour later, Haslush decided he'd gotten everything he needed out of Zorian and sent him on his way. Instead of going home, however, Zorian hung back. Once he had confirmed that Haslush was not going back to the scene of the crime, Zorian stealthily went back there in order to do some more fact-finding. There were guards posted in front of the house, but none were inside. Perfect. Zorian didn't dare enter the house himself, afraid that there was some kind of alarm on the house to notify the police of break-ins, but conjuring an ectoplasmic eyeball and sending it inside didn't seem to trip any warts, so he closed his eyes and had his eyeball spy look around the house. The bodies of Ray and Saw were long gone by this time, but it was not hard to figure out where each had died due to all the blood stains. Tragically, Ray seemed to have been killed in front of her daughter's room, trying to keep the attackers away from Notchka. She didn't go down without a fight. The bodies of the two giant centipedes, which the police decided to leave in the house for some reason, littered the entire area. They had been quite literally torn to pieces, their bodies sliced into sections by some powerful severing attack. In the end, though, it hadn't been enough. The door to Notchka's room was smashed open, the only door in the house to have been dealt with so destructively, her bed flipped over, and Notchka herself nowhere to be found. Zorian had been harboring a hope that maybe Notchka had turned into a cat when the attack had come and then escaped into the night, but that didn't seem likely anymore. It was beyond obvious now that Notchka had been taken by the attackers for some reason. Half an hour later, not having found anything similarly notable, he was ready to call it a day and go home. That's when he searched the place where Ray had died again, and noticed something interesting on the severed head of one of the centipedes. Faintly carved into the chitin of one of the forward sections of the centipede was a very familiar symbol. A circle with an archaic Icosian pictogram for heart inside of it. It wasn't the official symbol used by the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon, but it was one of the several secret signs that their lower order cultists used to signal other members of their membership. After inspecting the rest of the centipede parts and failing to find anything else significant, Zorian let the eye dissolve and walked away. So his initial suspicion was right. This wasn't some shady deal coming back to haunt Ray and her family, it was connected to the invasion somehow. Admittedly, Zorian had no idea how, but he knew where he could find that out. The cult of the World Dragon was going to get a lot more visits from Zorian in the coming days. After that day, Zorian's daily schedule changed completely. Kiriel lost all interest in magic and no longer attended the lessons he had organized for her, and he decided to free some more time by dropping his membership in Taven's group and skipping most of his classes. He spent most of this extra time planning and executing attacks on known members of the Cult of the World Dragon, trying to find out what they did with Notchka. He attacked them incessantly, hitting 2 or more locations a day, and ruthlessly memory probed every cultist he disabled in those excursions. He learned some interesting things doing that. For instance, while Sudamir Kandriai, the mayor of Nyazovdveri, was indeed a member of the cult, he was a very independent-minded one, to the point that the cult was very annoyed with him. They seemed to have no idea he was killing soul mages around his town, nor did he have any links to the Abasins as far as they knew. The man promised to give his flocks of iron beaks and hordes of winter wolves to the cult of the World Dragon, not to the invaders as a whole. Zorian supposed he might be in contact with the Abasins on his own initiative, but it was equally possible that his soul mage killing practices were his own thing. What he hoped to accomplish with that, Zorian could only guess. He also found some emergency resource caches that the cult scattered around the city, its underworld and surrounding villages. They looked very stealable. He made himself a note, a real written note, seeing as how he could now effectively take a notebook with him to the next restart, to search through those in some future restart for anything interesting or easy to sell for some quick cash. When it came to locating Notchka, however, his successes had been underwhelming. He managed to track down the group that kidnapped her, but they had simply been following orders and had long since handed her off to another group. He then tracked down that group too, but they no longer had her either and also didn't know who had her now. He had dived deeply and aggressively into their memories, shattering their minds beyond repair, but to no avail. The man they handed Notchka to was a total unknown to them, other than being a high-ranking member of the cult, and they had absolutely no idea where she might have ended up in. Truthfully, Zorian had already suspected that kidnapping Notchka had been the whole point of the attack on the Sashel family, so his findings weren't a huge surprise. The fact that the order had come from the very top of the cult indicated they considered it to be of critical importance. They also told both groups that Notchka had to be delivered alive and unharmed to the transfer point, forbidding abuse under the pain of death, which was also fairly strange. Why did they want Notchka so badly, and why was her continued health so important? He suspected the answer was something in line with she's their sacrifice to the primordial to wake him up. Demon summoning often involved ritual killings, so it wouldn't surprise him much if unbinding a primordial required the same. Still, why Notchka in particular? Because she was a shifter? The cultists did refer to the primordial as, among other names, he of the flowing flesh, which could indicate an ability to change its physical form. There were other shifters in the city though. Other cat shifters even. He didn't think he could get to the bottom of this by the end of the restart. If he had another week, maybe, but the restart was near its end and the cult of the World Dragon was getting more paranoid in the face of his constant assaults on them. They'd already tried to set up an ambush for him the last time he tried to attack a location, and only his ability to read people's surface thoughts kept him from stumbling into it and getting himself killed. He wasn't going to get much from them in the 2 days he had left before the summer festival. Although as horrible as Notchka's kidnapping was, it could prove to actually be a huge opportunity for him so long as it happened predictably in every restart. If he could place some kind of tracker on Notchka, she could lead him to the highest echelons of the Cult of Dragon, those who had stayed well hidden from him up until now. Also, if she really was intended as a sacrifice like he suspected, she could lead him to the place where the cult intended to perform their unbinding ritual, which could be a key to a lot of mysteries surrounding the cult's actions, perhaps even the time loop itself. He would have to wait and see how events would play out in the next restart. Can we talk? Zorian looked away from the novel he was reading and glanced towards Kiriel, who was currently standing on the doorway, nervously gripping one of the support beams. Strange. Kiriel had been very subdued and asocial ever since Notchka had disappeared, rarely ever bothering him anymore, so her approaching him like this was quite unexpected. Sure, he agreed easily. He wasn't doing anything important at the moment anyway. He was supposed to be organizing his notebook so he could store the latest blueprints in his mind, but he just didn't feel like doing that at the moment and was instead procrastinating with some light reading. He could spare some time for his little sister. What is it? She ran up to him and before he could tell her to stop, hurled herself on top of him. As he was currently lying on his bed, she ended up basically reenacting what had long become a very familiar scene to Zorian. Damn it, Kiri, I get enough of that crap at the beginning of each loop, thought Zorian but refrained from actually saying it out loud. Kiriel was already shaken up. No need to snap at her when she finally decided to open up a little. Where are your shoes? He asked instead. Don't tell me you've been walking around the house barefooted again? Kiriel glanced at her feet and gave him a guilty look. Don't be like Mom, Zorian. It was only one time. You're doing it right now too, Zorian pointed out. Okay, 2 times, she said, pouting. He put a bookmark into his novel, laid it aside, pushed her off of him and rose in a sitting position. She immediately mimicked him, sitting on the end of his bed beside him. They sat like that in silence for a while, Kiriel dangling her bare feet over the floor and staring at her toes like they were the most fascinating thing in the world. I'm sorry, she finally said. What are you sorry for? Asked Zorian, surprised. For being difficult. Difficult? Asked Zorian incredulously. He peered into her mind for a moment and found her thinking about Mother. Yeah, that did kinda sound like something their mother would say. She never did like crying much. One of the few things she praised him for was that he rarely cried, even as a young child. Kiri, you lost your friend. It's okay to be sad about that. You weren't being difficult at all. But you've been avoiding me all week, she mumbled. I wasn't avoiding you, he protested, aghast that she would even think that. I was just giving you some space to grieve in peace. You know? And besides, I was... She gave him a curious look when he didn't continue. You were what? Should he tell her? I was trying to find Notchka, he finally admitted. Her eyes widened at this. You were... Is that... You should have told me. I didn't want to get your hopes up, Zorian said. I was hoping anyway, she said, gripping the sheets tightly in her little fists. He put an arm around her shoulder and pulled her into an embrace. She was still tense but gradually relaxed after a while and returned his hug. I didn't find her, he admitted after a while. Well, obviously, she said as if it was the most self-evident thing ever. But you tried. You knew you probably weren't going to find her and you still went out and searched for her. You didn't cry and mope around the house all day like I did. Kiri, you're 9, Zorian sighed. What else could you have done? You're being way too hard on yourself. She didn't say anything to that. Eventually he decided to just spend some time playing cards with her and praising her drawings. Which did cheer her up in the end, so he chalked that up as one of his better ideas. One of these days, once he mastered the alteration spell he was using to transfer notes into subsequent restarts sufficiently, he should gather some of her artwork into an art book of some sort and copy it into the next restart. Showing her the drawings she herself had made in previous restarts was bound to produce some amusing reactions. Later that evening, Zorian decided he had given Kale enough time to wrap up his last-minute experiments and went down into the basement to retrieve the last of the Morlock's promised notebooks. The door was unlocked, so Zorian simply walked in and closed them behind him. As the door clicked shut, Zorian felt the sounds of the house above them disappear, the privacy portion of the wards placed on the basement engaging and soundproofing the room. Among many other things, the privacy measures were apparently a standard part of the warding package the Academy used to secure their workshops, and thus got added automatically to Amaya's basement when Kale had requested they turn it into a proper alchemical workshop. Something that was very convenient in moments like these, since it meant that Zorian didn't have to spend hours securing the room every time he wanted to talk to Kale about some sensitive subject. You done yet? Zorian asked the other boy. Kale ignored him for a moment, staring at some passage in the book in front of him, but then shook his head and pushed it away from him, massaging his eyes. Yes, I'm done, he said. He pointed at the notebook placed on top of a large stack of books. The notebook is there. Everything is ready on your end? Mostly, Zorian said. I still have to write down some stuff I found out today. Kale raised an eyebrow at him. I thought you said you were taking a break from the cult today? I did, Zorian said. Doesn't mean I did absolutely nothing though. Oh. Basically I was thinking about warding and how the upper-level cultists all lived in warded houses that were a pain to break into and was thinking of how to speed the process up. And then I remembered that there is not only already a type of tool to do that present on the black market, I actually know where to find one for free. The Arania had stolen a ward scanner from one of the invaders a while before the start of the time loop, and the device was surely still in the destroyed colony. You said you don't like going there, Kale noted. I don't, Zorian sighed. The place it has too many bad memories. And the corpses of the Arania are literally scattered all over the place, so it's hard to go there and not be reminded of that whole fiasco that saw them destroyed. I still think they were somehow ejected from the time loop rather than soul-killed, Kale said. I agree with what other people told you. Souls are indestructible. There has got to be a trick there. Yes, well, time travel is supposed to be impossible too, Zorian pointed out. Though I'll admit that I'm hoping you're right. Never mind that for the moment, the point is that I went there to find the ward scanner. And I couldn't find it. So? Kale asked. So, that means that either somebody already took it or that there is some secret part of the Iranian complex that I'm unaware of. And frankly, I think it's the latter. I mean, once I thought about it a little, the sheer emptiness of the Iranian settlement was very suspicious. The Siorian web was very wealthy and surely had a sizable treasury. The matriarch often implied they have some kind of storage full of trade items and such. But I never saw anything like that when I checked the settlement out earlier, probably because I was very uncomfortable there and in a hurry to leave. You think there is something important there? Time loop related? No, probably not, Zorian admitted. But I need every advantage over Red Robe I can get, and there could be a lot of useful stuff there. Who knows what the Arania have squirreled away over the years? True, Kale agreed, rising from his seat and popping his spine. Well, I'm tired. I think I'll go to sleep now. Is there anything else we need to talk about? There's nothing pressing I can think of, Zorian said, shaking his head. I see. Just so you know, I'll be taking Kana with me on a trip to a nearby village on the day of the summer festival. I don't really want to be in Syoria when the invasion comes, and I'm even less enthused about Kana being caught up in the invasion. I understand. I'm glad. If you want, I can take Kiriel with me, said Kale. I know you've been agonizing about what to do with her for a while now. Yeah, agreed Zorian. I don't want to leave her alone for the invasion, but at the same time I need to be able to move freely if I am to investigate what's happening with the invasion after all these changes. You think she'll agree to go with you? I don't know, that's up to you, Kale shrugged. All I can do is make an offer. Fine, I'll talk to her, Zorian sighed. That'll be a lovely talk, I can already tell. Notify me what you decided by tomorrow evening, said Kale. And just like that, the restart was already almost done. Tomorrow he would see how the invasion of the city proceeded this time around. Zorian looked over his things, trying to remember if he had forgotten something crucial in his rush to finish the preparations in time. He couldn't think of anything, but it would be just like him to forget something blindingly obvious while worrying about the irrelevant minutiae. He still had several hours to burn until the start of the invasion, however, so he left the preparations alone for a now and left his room to find some quick diversion. Remembering that Amaya kept a whole miniature library of exotic works in her house, he set off to browse its shelves in search of a good time waster. He found Amaya already there, though, staring at her collection with a faraway look. Miss Karashka? He asked worriedly. He was getting some worrying feelings from her with his empathy. Are you all right? She mumbled before her brain rebooted again and she truly focused on his presence. Oh, Zorian. How long have you been standing there? I only just came here. Been looking for a book to pass the time with, but you looked... Don't worry, she sighed. I'm just disturbed by the sudden quiet in the house. It looks so... lonely. Huh. I thought you'd be glad to have some peace and quiet for a change, Zorian said. She snorted. I think you're projecting your own attitude here a little, she said. Probably, admitted Zorian. He always did like to have some space from everybody else, and would have probably welcomed a situation like this in her place. But Kale and the girls are only gone for one day, so it's hardly a big deal. You could have gone with them, you know? I know. But if there really is rioting during the festival like you said there might be, I don't want to leave my house to the looters. It's the only thing I have left. Oh. Sorry, getting a little personal there, she smiled. Is there any particular book you were looking f-? There was a loud knock on the front door. Amaya and Zorian both raised their eyebrows at each other. Apparently neither of the two knew who might be coming for a visit in this time of day. Most people were getting ready to attend the summer festival somewhere, either at some friend's house or some other venue. Amaya hurried towards the door to see who it was. There was a brief pause where Amaya had a brief exchange with whoever was at the door, after which Amaya called out at Zorian to join them. Zorian, your date is here, she yelled. My date? He asked incredulously, more to himself than to anyone else. How could he have a date when he didn't? He didn't. But she totally did. As he came to the front door to see what Amaya was talking about, the frowning face of Akoja greeted him from the doorframe. "Hello Ako," Zorian said blandly. "What a surprise to see you here. I suppose Ilsa had something to do with this?" Yes," she fumbled, her composure breaking for a bit. "Miss Zalady told me to accompany you to the dance, since we are both without a partner. Now wasn't that interesting? How the hell had Ilsa known that?" True, Zorian had no date for the dance and in fact had no intention of attending the academy dance at all, but she shouldn't have been aware of that. Zorian had never told her anything to that effect, nor did he hint at that to anyone except. Damn. He gave his landlord a dirty look before refocusing back on Akoja. This was not part of the plan. He was supposed to roam around the city, observing the invaders in action and noting the changes to their tactics as a result of the various changes arising from the destruction of the Arania and that unfortunate mercenary band he'd hired to participate in the ambush. Sometimes he hated his empathy. Without it, he would never have known just how much this meant for Akoja and how hard blowing her off to do his own thing would hit her. "We still have several hours before we have to be at the dance hall. Come inside and wait with Amaya for a bit while I run some urgent errands in the city," he said. "What?" she stammered, confused as Zorian squeezed past her through the door and began walking into the city. "Wait, you can't just dash." Zorian quickly cast the teleport spell and let the city's teleport beacon draw him into Sayoria's teleport access point. He had lots of work to do and only so much time to execute it. "Break. What were you in such a hurry for earlier?" Akoja asked as they slowly made their way towards the academy. She was surprisingly calm and polite, all things considered. Zorian had thought she'd be more annoyed at him because of his emergency exit earlier. "I had something already arranged before you arrived. I had to take care of some things when you came knocking at Amaya's door," Zorian said. "Cancel some things and adjust others." Specifically, he was placing marker stones in various parts of the city to make scrying easier. Watching the invasion forces move through the city was not quite the same as ambushing isolated battle groups and rooting through their minds, but at least it was something. Maybe it was better this way. His original plan was kind of ambitious. Possibly too ambitious. As they talked, Akoja told him a little about how the rest of his classmates handled the changes to the restart. It was mostly just idle chat, though it did remind him that he hadn't paid much attention to his class in this restart. There was just so much to do in this particular restart that interaction with his classmates sort of fell by the wayside. Considering that one of his motivations for coming back to Sayoria had been to see and talk to them again, that was something that should probably be remedied in the near future. The night proceeded far more smoothly than the last one where he'd had Akoja as his date. She seemed to have far more respect and concern for his wishes this time around, though Zorian couldn't for the life of him figure out why. In some ways he had actually been a bigger jerk now than he had back then. Regardless, once the flares started hitting the city, he snuck away from her and started scrying the city for information. The initial barrage of artillery spells was different this time around. While the old artillery barrage used by the invaders specifically targeted critical buildings whose destruction was calculated to send the city into chaos and cripple its ability to organize a defense, the new barrage was uninspired. Oh, they still targeted the central police station, the city hall, and other obvious targets, but things like backup government buildings and armories were left intact. In fact, a lot of the flares seemed to have been aimed completely at random, demolishing unremarkable clusters of houses and civilian apartments, something that would admittedly greatly increase the number of deaths in the invasion, but was of questionable strategic benefit. Bizarrely, every single temple in the city was the target of at least one flare. Zorian had no idea what the invaders were trying to accomplish there, and it definitely wasn't something they did in their previous invasion plan. The fights around the city were far fiercer than they had been in Zorian's previous restarts. Partly it was due to the defenders being in a lot better shape this time around, courtesy of the invasion's poor choice of targets for their initial strike, but there was more to it than that. The invasion forces seemed a lot less coordinated than he remembered them being. They moved a lot less purposefully through the city and often blew off their apparent goals to rampage through the undefended civilian neighborhoods. That happened sometimes in the past as well, but never in such high numbers. As far as the initial attack on the academy went, the invaders chose their actions there just as poorly as they did elsewhere. The new barrage targeted the academy building directly instead of aiming for the less well-defended dormitories and support buildings like the old barrage did. Consequently, the flares simply splashed harmlessly off the heavy wards protecting the main complex, doing minimal damage. With no need to render aid and run damage control in the peripheral part of the academy, the teachers were free to keep their forces concentrated and organize the evacuation of the student body and other non-combatant employees much more competently than they had before. Funny, he originally thought the academy was massively incompetent for leading the students into massive underground death traps, especially since that involved going over vast swathes of open ground where they would be completely exposed. They didn't look so dumb right now. The evacuation went off without a single problem, and no one attacked them when they were shoved inside the shelters. Zorian was pretty sure at this point that he was looking at what the invasion was really like, what it would look like had Red Robe never given them any help. When he really thought about it, most of their mistakes could be chalked up to being far less well-informed and lacking the ability to bypass every ward and defense they encounter because they've been either keyed into them or knew how to counter it quickly. It would appear that Red Robe really did abandon the invaders in this restart, right down to the very end. Was this a one-time thing, or did Red Robe suddenly decide not to meddle in the invasion anymore? His musings were interrupted by Ilsa coming to the shelter and demanding that every combat-capable student come with her to defend the academy. Thanks to him participating in monster hunts with Taven's group, that included him as well, so he got up from his spot on the floor and joined the group of students following her outside. There he saw what had gotten Ilsa so concerned that she was recruiting students as defenders. The invaders were massing just outside the academy wards, preparing for an all-out assault. Entire regiments of war trolls, winter wolves and skeletons were present there, supported by their mage handlers and thick flocks of razor beaks. More unusually, there were a couple of flying drakes mixed in among the deadly corvids, and two bulky elephant-sized lizards stalked in front of the miniature army. Thunder lizards, Ilsa said distastefully from beside him. Immensely tough and very destructive. They can breathe arcs of electricity in a straight line in front of them, so try not to fight them from the front if you are forced to engage them at all. Lovely. He never saw those in any previous restarts. Maybe this was something they never felt like committing to the battlefield because they never felt they needed them? But the time for considering such things was over. Although clearly not fully assembled for attack, the commander of the monstrous horde urged his forces to charge ahead. Maybe he felt that waiting for the rest of the forces would be a bad move since the academy defenders were busily fortifying their positions, or maybe he was just impatient. Either way, they surged ahead, thunder lizards leading the charge. Zorian knew he could offer very little by simply pouring some more offensive spells into the attacking horde along with the rest of the defenders, but he had a better idea anyway. Focusing on the two thunder lizards, he felt their simplistic minds and was overjoyed to find out that they were far less magically resistant than he had feared. He suspected that might be the case. The invaders were probably controlling those things with mind magic to begin with, so it would only make sense that they were not all that resistant to it. Regardless, this meant he could manipulate them. Not to the extent of directing them like puppets, but enough to negate their attacks. Sure enough, when the lizards started approaching the makeshift barricades that the teachers had made out of the ground via alteration spells, the two lizards opened their toothy mouths and tried to blow up the barricades with their thunder attack. Zorian quickly seized control of their movements and made them angle their heads towards one another, their thunder attacks colliding with each other's bodies. A surge of anger flooded the minds of the two thunder lizards, and they halted their charge in favor of roaring at each other, too dumb to realize their actions were caused by outside influence. Zorian seized on this opportunity, amplifying their wrath and urging them to fight each other, and the two of them promptly collided with each other and began fighting to the death. To their credit, the rest of the invading forces simply flowed around the two battling behemoths, unconcerned with their failure. The battle was joined. Zorian stared at the battle site full of corpses, more than a little bit dazed. He had been in a fair amount of battles ever since he'd gotten pulled into the time loop, but nothing quite like this. The fight had quickly turned chaotic once the two forces seriously started engaging one another, and even now that it was over, Zorian still wasn't sure what exactly happened there. They won in the end, repulsing the attackers. The mages decided to flee when enough of their monster minions got killed, but they lost far more people in the attack than Zorian had thought they would. Zorian himself was surrounded by a pack of winter wolves at one point and only survived thanks to no less than 5 blasting rods he had smuggled into the dance hall with him. Well, that and Kieran's timely arrival with reinforcements to drive the attackers back. He jumped in fright when someone's heavy hand clasped his shoulder suddenly, almost blowing their head off with a reflexive piercer before he realized it was just Kieran. "You're the one that was messing with the heavy hitter monsters during the whole fight, aren't you?" his combat teacher asked. "Yeah," Zorian shrugged. "No need to keep it a secret this close to the end. I felt that was the most effective way of contributing to the battle that I was capable of. Well, that flying drake would have roasted poor Nora alive if you hadn't made it plow into the ground suddenly, so thanks for that. Though we're really going to have to talk about how you learned how to do that and what exactly your limits are." "Ha," Zorian snorted. "It's far too late for that, I'm afraid." "Oh?" Kieran asked, a mixture of warning and curiosity in his voice. "Yes," Zorian confirmed. He consulted his watch to see what time it was. It was 2 hours and 39 minutes after midnight. "I'm afraid this loop is just about to end." Kieran stared at him blankly for a few seconds before opening his mouth to say something. Before he could utter a single word, though, everything went black and Zorian woke up back in Siren, ready to start this month anew.